So welcome. Welcome to a very cool afternoon here in the pavilion. We have a wonderful program here, and we recognize that it's going to be difficult to sit through the entire thing without getting up, moving around, getting some water. So we're going to build in a little bit of time to allow people to survive this afternoon, because that's what the Resilience Hub is about. I want to thank the Resilience Hub team, the Race to Resilience team, the Atlantic Council, Zurich, our partner in this event. It's been a great experience to kind of internalize these issues. You know, if this is going to be the Adaptation Finance COP, having a panel on adaptation finance to kick off the afternoon couldn't be any better. And I think we're going to see here that there's an immense opportunity, particularly for the private sector to step in, but there's also a lot of challenges as well. So we have a program that's really intended to look at various aspects of this, and we've brought experts from across the board. So I'm not one of them, so I'm going to shut up and just introduce our important speakers. And we're very, very fortunate to have today Daniel Ioshpe. Jorge helped me with that one, I have to admit, who is the Brazilian high-level champion, which means a lot of this is his doing, bringing this meeting together, engaging the private sector in these issues, and the leadership he has shown is really what we're going to kind of come out of this meeting and do things that we perhaps haven't done before. So, Daniel, with that, I'll give you the floor. You can set the tone, and we're going to spend the next 2 hours kind of picking up on your messaging. So thank you for being with us.
Tudo bom? I'll just make a quick remark that I'm really Dan Yoshpe, not Daniel, and my uncle Daniel, he dated the previous president of Brazil. So it's a serious thing to confuse me with him, and maybe the president comes in and looks for him. But anyway, so dear partners and friends, it is a real pleasure to join you today at the Resilience Hub. It's fitting that we meet here in the Amazon, a living reminder of what's at stake and what we must protect. COP30 is here for a reason, to move action where it matters most. This is what the action agenda is about, connecting governments and non-state actors to ensure that what's agreed in negotiation rooms is delivered on the ground. At its heart lies climate resilience. While we work hard to cut emissions, we must also prepare for the changes already here. Adapting to climate impacts isn't just about protection. It's an investment in safer communities, stronger economies, and a more stable future. Resilience must be embedded in everything we invest in, and finance is the great enabler of this transformation. Insurance as an enabler of adaptation. That's the story. Risk management and insurance are not just financial tools. They are critical enablers of adaptation planning for governments, companies, and financiers. Insurance equips countries with vital climate risk and resilience insights and can help bring down the cost of capital. This is essential for national adaptation plans. It is the de-risking mechanism of society, and when aligned with sound practices and policies, it can unlock capital for adaptation and resilience investments. The insurance sector is mobilized on an institutional level. With the best climate risk analytics available, insurers have become the forecasters of society, guiding governments and investors towards smarter, more resilient decisions. Contributing to the COP30 action agenda, Axis 6, Objective 21, the plan to accelerate solutions, fostering investable NAPs and implementations, is mobilizing the finance, insurance, philanthropy, and private sector for delivering $1 trillion in project pipelines for adaptation. That is why the COP30 action agenda places finance and insurance at its core, bridging public and private efforts to strengthen adaptive capacity and resilience. Insurance and risk reduction are precisely the kinds of interventions where public policy and private finance must work together. by improving data access, enabling regulatory flexibility, and promoting risk-sharing mechanisms. Policymakers can make insurance-driven adaptation both viable and inclusive. By rethinking how risk is identified, priced, and shared, we can turn vulnerability into opportunity. Aligning insurers, financial institutions, and climate policy frameworks will make adaptation investable at scale, transforming protection into a pathway for growth and resilience. As we look toward COP30, we have a unique opportunity to align capital, capacity, and collaboration, moving the global goal on adaptation from commitment to implementation. Let us move forward together, not as an obligation, but as one of the greatest economic and social development opportunities of our lifetime. Thank you, and I wish you have a productive time here in Belém, not necessarily fresh, but productive. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan. And I was so focused on not butchering the introduction of Dan, which I did anyways. I didn't introduce myself. My name is Francis Bouchard. I'm with Marsh McLennan. It's a pleasure to be emceeing this event today. The next panel really starts us down this path of what Dan was saying we need to do in terms of moving to implementation. This one is about identifying national risk and prioritizing risk at a national level. And to lead this panel, we have a dear friend of mine, but also a true industry leader in Ekoshwe Iahan, who serves as the Secretary General of the Insurance Development Forum, which is out there doing a lot of this work with many of the major insurers behind them. So Ekoshwe, if you want to bring your panel up here and introduce, and we may cut you off a little early to give people a drink chance, a water break. The drink break comes a little later. But please welcome Ekoshwe and her panel.
Okay, thank you very much, Francis. You were very humble when you said you're not an expert, but you also didn't. I don't think that's true. And we all know the force that you have been in terms of getting this resilience hub together and getting the industry behind it. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. So yes, we have a fantastic session to get us going, and where the theme is focused on national risk and resilience priorities. And as Francis said, I think this is very apt at the moment when we think about what's happening in the world right now. I think those of you who would have been looking in the news, you can see that we have a typhoon that is tearing through Vietnam. It's tearing through the Philippines. We've seen the experiences of Jamaica recently. So this discussion around resilience and adaptation could not be more urgent. And this topic of how we use or understand risk and leverage the capabilities that exist within the industry. So we have a fantastic lineup of speakers who I'm so pleased to have us join us. We have Ritu Barajwash, I hope I pronounced it right, who's the director. I'm not very sensitive about my name. Okay. Who's the director of Climate Resilience, Finance, and Loss and Damage at the International Institute for Environment and Development. In addition to that, we have Linda Freiner, Chief Sustainability Officer at Zurich Insurance Group. And finally, and certainly not least, Jennifer Romeo Torres, who's the head of sustainable investment at the Asian Development Bank. So 3 different perspectives: a research institution, development bank, Asia, significant, as well as Linda bringing perspectives from the industry. So respecting Francis's recommendation, we keep to time. I'll give everybody about 5 minutes or a little less to sort of address the questions. So I'll start off with you, Ritu, with a few questions. You just published an issue paper looking at the potential value of resilience investments for emerging developing economies. What are some of the headlines from that piece of research? What does it tell us about the opportunities and challenges around attracting investment into resilience? We hear a lot about PPPs, right? The need for the industry to do more, but what does that actually mean? And then finally, you've studied the economics of adaptation finance. What are some of the barriers to investments, and where have you seen them successfully addressed?
Thank you. And to all of you, we published a paper today, and probably you can get access access to that paper through the organizers here. But I'm going to start with some of the facts that we already know. That disasters have increased, and you already mentioned a few examples. Disasters have increased fivefold in the last 5 decades. And the one most impacted are the countries which don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the coping capacity to deal with them. And what we typically see is the physical damage that these LDCs, SIDS, and other developing countries face. But the impacts are far-reaching and quite often invisible, or we sometimes address them as hidden handbrakes within the system, which constrains the investment in resilience. One of them is every time a country is hit by disasters, their debt levels go up. And we have ample evidence around that. Apart from that, all the other indicators that credit rating entities typically use to assess the credit worthiness of a country, right from fiscal deficit, tax revenue volatility, all of those factors get negatively impacted. More than that, currency fluctuation is another issue that impacts countries' economy badly as a result of climatic impact. So typically, a developing country, or even worse, LDC or SIDS, their own macroeconomical situation is so bad that they are constrained in terms of investing in resilience. And the other actors in the ecosystem who could come forward and help them in building that resilience that can support them in being able to defend the climate disaster much better. You have climate funds, which is not more than 60 billion has flown to the LDCs or SIDS for adaptation. And what we have on the table is around 300 billion, which is not even sufficient to meet 10 to 15% need of resilience of these countries. We have MDBs and private sector, which has much talked about, and we work very closely with ADB as well. We all know that MDBs are risk averse, and rightly so. You are a bank. You can't put your money in where you can't get it back. And we have private sector, which again looks at adaptation and resilience more from a philanthropic angle, a social investment, because for them it's a cost. It's not an investment which will give them returns. And this will continue to be the way, because many of the LDCs and SIDS, their credit rating is in the junk grade. So obviously, private sector does not look at those countries as an investment opportunity. So what we tried to look into whether insurance sector risk analytics can open the door for those investments. And what we found was, and we are very thankful to our colleagues from Zurich, which helped us carry out some of the analysis. And many of you are from the insurance sector, so you know that insurance sector has a CAT models. They do on-the-site risk engineering, which helps you understand that if you don't do this investment, this is the level of losses you will suffer, and your premium would go up. Now, that's the level of intelligence that many of the private sector governments or even MDBs don't have. And the moment you bring that knowledge in the table, the things change. And to prove that point, in our paper, we sought help from our Zurich colleagues to do this forward hazard assessment, like what would be the probability of disasters or hazards on 5 power plants across 5 regions. And what it worked out to be that their average loss would be around 50 million. And if those risk analytics was included and resilience investment was made, it would come down to as much as 10 million would be saved per year, but 20 billion over a course of 20 years. Now, that's the level of knowledge that you really need on the table. And why this is needed is because imagine a power sector failing to work for one day, the far-reaching cascading impact that it would have on the economy as a whole. So what we are saying that if you integrate that knowledge of avoided losses, you can easily make that investment in resilience as a proactive, positive investment rather than looking at it purely from a social philanthropic angle. So in our paper, we have projected some of those analysis as to what this would look like. And one final point, I know we are running out of time, is globally, 50% of the infrastructure is yet to be built. And in Africa, 80% of the infrastructure needed is yet to be built. So either we go in and make that investment in a climate-blind manner and make all of that infrastructure, useless for meeting the future climate disasters or impacts, or we go in armed with risk analytics and make sure that those investments are made in a way that they can face tomorrow's disasters.
Thank you, Ritu, for that. I think you've hit on a lot of points that actually drive why a lot of the industry members are around this event, but also at COP, because historically we've also not seen insurers as present as what we see today. And I think that speaks to some of the issues that we're also seeing emerging. So that really takes me, wow, the rain. Sorry, the rain. So I will try and speak loudly. And that is a perfect segue to Linda. And Linda, there are a few questions for you. What role do you see for insurers in supporting national adaptation planning and processes? Because what Ritu said is that we have governments who don't really understand or see the value that insurance can add in terms of some of the huge investments that are going to be taking place. The second question is, we hear a lot, we will hear a little bit later about this Zurich Climate Resilience Alliance. How does that philanthropic initiative also sit alongside commercial action? And I think that this is a tension that is worth speaking to, because the industry is also very different from maybe banks and others. So perhaps you can share a little bit of nuance around that. And then finally, are they complementary or perhaps not? Over to you, Linda.
So first of all, we should be happy that we're not outside, because I was outside and Phil was as well earlier when the last rain comes. So we should be happy that we're sitting here sweating. Look, I've actually not been to COP since Paris. And I went there and I talked about resilience in a small little side event somewhere. And that was about all the discussions around resilience at the time. So I'm really happy that that has been brought up to the agenda at this COP. Look, I think needless to say, and Ritu already alluded to that, from an insurance perspective, of course, we think that risk assessment, climate risk modeling needs to be the foundation of national adaptation planning. I think the challenge that we've seen, and I spent the last week in Sao Paulo, being part of the financing discussions with the MDBs and so on, everyone just sees insurers as the risk carrier, the one providing the risk transfer. They do not look at us, and we need to maybe do a better job ourselves to actually show them that we can also offer the risk assessments, the modeling, and the engineering expertise to be able to really quantify this risk and also quantify the benefits of actually avoiding these losses. So that's something, I think, the message that we will bring to COP and during this week. And I think particularly when it comes from an investment perspective, investors need to see the ROI of adaptation financing, and insurers can really help with the quantification of that. Look, we have done a couple of cases. We have worked with the city of Madrid, where we have applied these risk assessment, modeling, and engineering capabilities to really try to identify vulnerabilities and put in place the right adaptation measures against extreme heat, and particularly in schools. And I'm, of course, also very delighted about the collaboration between the Insurance Development Forum, ADB, around Pacific and Island countries, where we are looking at how can we put up a good insurance solutions for infrastructure development. So these are just a few examples. And this is really cool with the rain, by the way. When it comes to your questions around the Climate Resilience Alliance, and this is the reason why I joined Zurich, and I look at the man who is actually behind that mistake. No, thank you, Francis. Again, this is just a program that we set up over 10 years ago, and Debbie's going to talk to it a bit later, to really find new ways of enhancing resilience to flooding at the beginning in particularly vulnerable communities. And for us, it's really an extension of our business. It's about using our skills and expertise and bring those to communities where we do not have a commercial presence. And there's a reason why we don't have a commercial presence. The risks are just too high. We need to reduce the risk. We need to increase the resilience to actually make these communities first more resilient. And look, we started out in 2013. We have worked in 29 programs across 24 countries, impacting over 3 million people. So we really see that bringing that insurance expertise into these communities work. And of course, we also leverage at Zurich the expertise that we bring back from these programs. So it's extremely rewarding work that we have done. And of course, this program is also part when we look at our own transition, which includes both mitigation but also resilience, and this program is a key piece of that. So I think I just want to end with building on the most important thing that we need to put forward here is today that we can't afford to build today's infrastructure for the risks of yesterday, right? The risks are going to evolve and they're going to change so much. So we need to really build better before in the future.
So thank you very much, Linda, for that. I think your examples point to some of the capabilities that exist within the industry to address precisely the points that Ritu had flagged. That it goes beyond just the underwriting capability. Is how do we use the risk analytics to actually inform the investments that are being made, the solutions, if it's at a sovereign level or if it's at an individual level. So I really want to turn now to you, Jennifer, to really sort of focus more on the development bank perspective. You have a membership base of countries who are struggling with this issue. And going back to the theme, again, of national risk and resilience prioritization, that is something that you confront every day when you look at your members. Again, going to Vietnam and Philippines over the last few days. How do the multilateral development banks think about adaptation financing? What does your engagement with sovereigns look like? And how effectively are countries thinking about adaptation? I have two other questions, which is how closely does the ADB work with insurers? And finally, how can risk prioritization become more consistent across countries? So it's a lot of questions.
So there's a lot of questions. So thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jennifer Torres. I come from the Philippines, which is currently being ravaged by typhoon at the moment, but still happy to be here in Belém. Just let me break down some of the questions. What do MDB thinks about, adaptation finance? It's a huge priority for us. It's basically central to the development of many countries. And for us, we have actually doubled our commitments to adaptation finance. And we have now set very ambitious target by 2030 to at least, provide $41 billion annually for adaptation, particularly to low and middle income countries. And of course, part of that is to mobilize $65 billion from the private sector. So looking ahead, as mentioned, adaptation is no longer optional for us. It's a core development issue. And it's not just about scaling up finance. It's how to ensure that we're building resilience in every investment decision. So MDBs, the way how we approach adaptation finance, they're actually in three ways. First one is incremental changes, like making sure that our roads and, for example, roads and bridges, they are more resilient to floods. We look at adaptation as a shared objective that goes hand in hand with development. Making sure that, say, for example, when you're improving water system, you're also not just supporting farming, but you're also supporting drought, you're reducing drought risk. And of course, the third aspect is the transformational adaptation. And these are big systemic changes, making sure that, how we look at how we would redesign urban planning, how do we look at, the use of nature-based solutions, and basically integrating resilience into the development planning process of the country, and that's very important. The way we engage with sovereigns, of course, is that we make sure that it is programmatic, and it's a very country-driven approach. We align, of course, with the country's national priorities, their development strategies, and of course, the systems. It's very important that, we look at now that countries, they have their national adaptation plans, and it's ADB who actually helps support with, say, financing, technical assistance, and capacity building, and making sure that adaptation is embedded, again, into their public financial management, in their budget, so that, there is no unsustainable debt levels, and making sure that resilience is being built into their investment planning. So it's now becoming part of their core economic planning process. It's important that, adaptation is to be led by the government. They need to take ownership. And ADB supports, as I have mentioned, is actually there. We try to tailor our support, our intervention, looking at the country-specific context, the risks, the fiscal space, the institutional capacity, and we provide whatever is needed to actually support those countries. In integration, we're not looking at individual projects, but making sure how we build long-term resilience into their informed, make the, the planning process, the investment decisions built with long-term resilience measures. Now, when countries have very strong programmatic and clear resilience targets, it creates investor trust, right? So you're actually even able to actually crowd in investors to participate in adaptation programs. And that's why it's important that the blended finance is actually now a game changer. And even insurance, so the use of credit enhancements, guarantees and insurance, actually you crowd in private capital to actually participate in adaptation projects. So again, it's very important that you have to have that clear programmatic and clear resilience targets. And many of the countries, how do the countries look at adaptation? We've seen many progress already. Many of the countries now, they have their national adaptation plans. We see promising trends like the countries are now driving the shift toward systemic changes. Again, looking at how they make their urban planning more resilient, using nature-based solutions. Even disaster risk planning is important. Big picture is Asia and the Pacific is actually the word, it's prone to the most disaster-prone region in the world. And we're home to 4.5 billion people that are faced with intensifying climate risks. So it's important that they now integrate, disaster risk planning into their, in their investment decisions. So again, how do we actually work with the insurers? As she has mentioned, the insurance is not just a risk carrier. You're the experts. And some of the most advanced models for assessing climate risk and disaster risk. So we're ADB, we're actually tapping into that expertise. As you well know, we've been collaborating with, with the insurance industry, with the IDF. We have direct partnership with both global and regional players. A very good example is that, we're trying to look at, say, for example, the insurable infrastructure resilience in the Pacific countries and also in Southeast Asia. It's important that we bring the risk analytics into the investment decision process. And what it means is that using the insurance capability to actually provide the data, identify vulnerabilities, and how you would design, the products, say, for example, parametric insurance and catastrophe bonds. So those are becoming very, very good example. Again, let me just highlight some example that, for example, we're looking at a risk layer disaster financing facility in Kyrgyz Republic and Tajikistan, where we try to combine innovation of contingent disaster facility with sovereign catastrophe bonds, so that these solutions to help scale up disaster preparedness of the country, making sure that countries are actually resilient and are able to recover after disaster strikes. So again, for us to narrow the gap on adaptation finance, it's all about innovation, it's all about partnerships, it's about how we look at adaptation not just as a consequence, but as a part of the risk-informed decision-making of the country towards building their pipeline of projects.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those excellent conversations. I know that I need to wrap it up, but I will just say, perhaps for the next session, one of the things that I would be keen to see is to have a government representative here, right? I was tasked with trying to give people a taster of where insurance can add value when we talk about resilience and adaptation. And I will close perhaps with just a bit of a reflection. Earlier this year, we had the Prime Minister of Barbados, who challenged us with this idea that what is not insurable is not investable. And that comment was built on the recognition that because there are these thin insurance markets, because of the increasing impacts on countries, there is a real challenge in terms of mobilizing finance that is needed to actually build the very resilience that is required. And so as out of that collaboration, we generated a report which offered recommendations, and recommendations not only to the insurers in terms of, incorporating and extending their capabilities to corners where those tools are needed. It was a recommendation that also spoke to the MDBs in terms of leveraging these capabilities in advising their clients, but also governments in creating the right policy frameworks and space to actually drive resilience and adaptation in the way that it needs to be. So thank you to the audience for your patience and listening to us, but hopefully you got a flavor from the excellent panelists in terms of the tone that we are trying to set in terms of prioritizing a risk at a national level. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Don't go anywhere yet. you might get a question. But I thought we might do, if people want water, or you want to get up or go take a shower somewhere, if you can find a shower, I'm going to give people a little bit of a break to kind of get up. This is going to be a long afternoon if we're going to be sitting here. But I thought while we're doing that, we could ask a question, because there was a lot of wonderful content that was delivered. But if you want to get up and get some water or get a coffee, if that makes you feel better, or take a jacket off, feel free. But is there a question from the audience that our excellent panel might be able to answer?
If nobody else.
Over in the corner here.
There are questions. See Jorge, and another question on this end.
Thank you. It's a privilege and honor to be part of this great side events. My name is Tirtho Prasad Soikia. I work with an organization called NEEDS, Northeast Affected Area Development Society. We are based in Assam in northeast part of India. This is great to reflect how national risk and resilience prioritization is happening in this discussion. I'd like to reflect the area that I belong, that is actually geopolitically very strategic. It's actually surrounded by 99.9% international border, and we have a lot of investment from the international financial institution, including ADB. There are a lot of dams have been happening, which is generating more than 80,000 megawatt, causing untold miseries to the people in the downstream. So can we talk about the localization integration in the national risk resilience prioritization, which can promote locally led humanitarian response and also locally led development? And secondly, can we also discuss about how we can integrate local and indigenous early warning mechanisms in the national risk and resilience prioritization? We are very much grounded in the community, and we'd like to happen it, and we'd like to discuss and take it to the policy development process at the local level. Thank you.
So I think the question was about localizing. So
Thank you for raising that point, because it would seem that we are talking probably about the corporate world, private sector, MDB, without talking about the community. So thank you for bringing that flavor in. See, one thing that we did, from what we understood based on looking more into how insurance sector really works, their risk analytics works. It's not just about the software projecting where the disasters would occur. It's the on-site risk engineering which matters to understand what the slope is, what the topography is, what the soil type is, what's the building material used. So all of that has an impact on how strongly a disaster would be felt in an area. So what we really want is that intelligence, that knowledge to be discussed with the community, to be then used for locally led adaptation. See, I'm from India, and I myself work a lot on MGNREGS. It's the world's largest public works-based social protection program, where communities develop a lot of these watershed structures, soil conservation, moisture conservation, land, all of the factors that you typically need for flood prevention or drought proofing. Now, communities are quite capable in telling you exactly what's needed where. But where they fail is they don't understand what's going to happen in terms of future climate hazards, how that might manifest itself at the local level. But the moment you combine that knowledge with the community's traditional knowledge, the result would be game-changing, because what would come out would be not just sturdy and impactful today in terms of preventing disasters, but also be relevant for future. So definitely, all of that knowledge combined with community level knowledge is very, very important.
I think it's a great question, and I think we're seeing some innovation around that space. One of the points I would say is worth reflecting on is that when we think about risk and the changing nature of risk, a lot of the innovation that's going to be required, even within the insurance industry, is going to require being closer connected to the work at a local level. If it is to NGOs, helping to define better humanitarian response, understanding those risks and designing the very solutions. So it is definitely, I think, an important question. Jorge?
Hi. Hopefully, can you hear me all right? I can come up. I'll come a little closer as well. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. Kind of a follow-on from that question. You have been talking about getting insurance to communities that haven't historically been insured because of high risks, but there's also a major trust issue with the insurance industry as it stands. So I was wondering from your experiences how you go about combating that and actually building a real relationship with communities as you try to improve resilience and reduce risk.
I think there is one issue that we're having, and that is, of course, to understand what insurance can and cannot do. And insurance is built on a principle of solidarity. And that means, and that solidarity requires that the risk is random and unsystemic. What we're seeing, of course, with climate change is the risks are coming more and more, frequent and it's a higher impact. And the reality is, of course, that will impact people that choose to live in flood-prone areas more than others. And the challenge we're going to have, like if you don't have that principle of solidarity, you're basically going to have people that live in low-risk areas subsidizing people living in high-risk areas. And then we can no longer pool the risk, because then we will have so much losses in one area, we wouldn't be able to pay out claims in another. So what we need to do is really to lower the risk and reduce the risk. And Debbie will talk about what the Zero Climate Resilience Alliance is doing to be able to really reduce the risk first. Then insurance mechanisms can come, and we have a lot of new types of insurance mechanisms that are coming that can help provide protection, such as parametric insurance. But we first do reduce the risk.
So maybe I can add on to that. Trust is something that you build, right? It's a long-term endeavor that one undertakes. And I think that there is a lot that needs to be done around education and awareness around insurance, and as Linda has said, where its value is and where it might not be relevant. I would also challenge a little bit the idea when we think about communities and their approach and thinking around insurance. Sorry. Yes, I should hold this closer. In many ways, I come from the Caribbean, I come from Nigeria, and the communities I come from, they have these programs that they call SUSU, which is essentially communities that pool risk within their community. So the concept of insurance and a solidarity mechanism is not necessarily foreign. The question is that that system is challenged in some ways in terms of how people understand it, given the changing risk landscape. How is that built into public financial management to offer the kind of protection that people and citizens need who might not also be able to afford? And so I think that this is a space that is actually ripe for incredible innovation. Innovation in terms of how we understand the risk, the tools that exist, and to define innovation in terms of the solutions and the trust that is required with those communities. So I just wanted to offer that.
All right, please join me in thanking our panel. And I have no idea what this is like if you're trying to live stream this, if you can hear or not. You can hear? Great. Because it's very loud here. Now we have thunder to even make it more exciting. So I think this panel did a wonderful job of kind of articulating the underpinning of the role the insurance sector can play. Our next panel is going to take a slightly deeper look, maybe peel a couple layers off the onion and really look more at the risk identification and the role that various sectors can play in both evaluating the economic impact of some of these risks, but also of reducing them. And I think some of the stuff we'll hear on this panel will be, I think, quite encouraging, because we are starting to come together. I think there were several references to hearing more and more about the insurance story. Outside, not too far from here, there's an insurance house. It's the first time it's been done. But there's two weeks of entire programming on insurance. So it really is stepping up in terms of its role and significance in these topics. So the next panel is going to be run by a colleague of mine, Amy Barnes, who is the head of climate and sustainability strategy for Marsh, and she also leads the energy practice. So it's not a theoretical issue for us. And she'll have a wonderful panel with her as well, which you can introduce, Amy.
Well, the best thing is I could hear you, so.
I'm shocked.
So I'd love it if my panelists would come up and join me.
Thank you, Amy. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Camila Rodriguez-Taylor. I work within IDB Invest in the climate and environment team that is part of the IDB group.
And Ilya?
It's great to be here. My name is Ilya Azaroff. I'm an architect, and I'm the incoming president-elect for the American Institute of Architects. We're the largest professional design organization in the world, in over 120 countries with over 100,000 members. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. And John.
Oh, Amy, thank you for having me. John Colas, I'm partner and vice chair at the management consultancy Oliver Wyman, which is one of the 4 businesses of Marsh McLennan. So on behalf of Marsh McLennan and Oliver Wyman, welcome. Great to be here. And my focus historically has been on the financial services sector over the last 4 decades, and I currently lead our climate and sustainability practice globally.
So as we sit here today, I think it's 11 developed world 11 developed world countries and 67 developing countries have so far submitted adaptation plans. So they aren't extensive, but you represent LAC, Camilla, and so I'd love to turn to you first to understand the work that's happening in Latin America. And I should say the reason we're delighted to have Camilla here is because right now Alfred and Svenja Szyminski from Marsh McLennan are launching a paper that's looking at 10 cities in Latin America and the state of adaptation. So would you mind just sharing a bit about the paper that's currently being published?
Yes, absolutely, and thank you for the opportunity to share the insights of this paper. So we developed this COP30 flagship adaptation report, and it identifies and highlights, of course, as we all know, the urgency of financing adaptation, and it highlights examples of how we can scale and do it faster, because we don't only need to scale, but we need to do it very quickly. It also highlights that climate resilience is not a choice. It's an economic and social necessity. We've been hearing this in the opening remarks. Adaptation is at the forefront of what we need to do. And a startling statistic is that 1.2 million are lost every hour in Latin America and the Caribbean due to natural disasters. That's 1.2 million per hour. To hurricanes, droughts, and flooding. Of course, as you all know, the most marginalized are the most affected, and what we are seeing is that there can be a decline per capita of GDP of up to 10%. So these are some of the data that we have been recollecting, and we also underscore in the report what are the opportunities for Latin America and the Caribbean in accelerating adaptation. So we need to coordinate, we need to innovate, and we also need to be able to finance solutions that are not only for the current risks that we are facing, but also the future risks. And as greenhouse gas emissions continue to increase, these risks will continue to increase as well. But to end on a good note, during the past 5 to 10 years, we have definitely scaled the toolkit that we have for adaptation solutions and for financing adaptation. And so if we put these to work, we would definitely be able to close and bridge that adaptation gap of 47 billion per year by 2035.
It's really easy to dwell on the obstacles, but there are good things happening. That being said, I am going to ask you, specifically in the context of the report, to talk about some of the hurdles that the report identifies in bringing resilience to cities and larger communities.
So we have 5 big hurdles, and these are not only for cities, but for all adaptation investments. First is the financing gap. We are talking about finance being fragmented, about it being insufficient, and what we are seeing that it relies heavily on post-disaster public spending, and what we see is that there are no clear plans for building back better that can be deployed quickly. We see that there's a governance challenge in terms of political cycles and poor communication between different sectors of government and institutional capacity and collaboration between public and private sector. We also see there's low technical expertise and access to technologies. This includes understanding what are the risks and being able to evaluate the costs of inaction, to be able to build cases for investments, for example, in the private sector. And something that is important in this connection between climate and the natural biodiversity agenda is that we are seeing threats to the natural capital, and this is affecting the ecosystem services that provide adaptation benefits, such as like freshwater ecosystems. And lastly, the fifth one is the lack of insurance or understanding of what the role insurance can play, and how to structure these insurances so that they can actually provide support.
And just in 1 minute, because I suspect Francis is going to want to keep me to time regardless. Yep, okay. Just in 1 minute, what do you see as the role in the private sector, especially when you're operating at city and community levels? The role of the private sector.
So the private sector plays a huge role. It has to be able to compensate for what the public spending cannot cover. We have a program within IDB group that is called Ready and Resilient Americas that supports the collaboration between public and private sector. The private sector can come in after a disaster to provide supplies. It can develop technology such as alert systems. It can develop technology for adaptation for agriculture. It can play a role in generating the supply chain that needs to be deployed to be able to access adaptation solutions. And it also can plan ahead and invest in technologies that will improve the resilience.
Thank you so much. Ilya, may I turn to you and talk a bit about the built environment? So we know that about 80% of the buildings that exist now will still exist in 2050. But in the earlier panel, we also heard that 50% of the infrastructure that is to be built is yet to be built. So there's a lot of building that's going to happen over the next few decades, and we need to be building right, and we need to be building resilient. So what's the role of the architect in that ecosystem, and their role in bringing finance to it as well?
So you said we have only a few minutes. So that is a big question. For architects, there's a couple of things. Our role and our oath of service is the health, safety, and welfare of the public. You're asking the exact question. How are we retrofitting existing buildings and building for the future? So I really loved what the previous panel had going on. When we look at adaptation and mitigation, it's really important as architects that we do both of those, two sides of the same coin. If we don't do those together, we are missing the immediate need of the public that is being displaced by disasters, and we're not taking care of what the future holds. And what I mean by that, every minute of every day, 24 people are displaced by disasters. Last year alone, 120 million people at the cost of $420 billion US dollars. That's only infrastructure loss. The loss of economy, which is what we have to get at, what we really have to get at, is over $2 trillion in loss. So when you ask what the role of the architect, I love where you're going with that community convening. The role of the architect is to help translate, gather people together and partner so we understand clearly what the community needs and help understand what that future hazard assessment is. How do we look towards the next 7 generations, considering the 7 generations of the past? How do we really look at what those developments need to look like and how to spend that money substantially but properly? Every dollar spent, according to the National Institute of Building Science in the US, every dollar spent is $6 saved in the infrastructure, but it's another $7 saved on the social and economic side. That's $13. So on the ROI, our members are really dedicated to doing this work. So we can show it at the very small level, every individual house, to the very large level, working with cities to understand what that future holds and helping understand where you spend your money first, second, third. So you don't have those cascading effects that fail in mid-development. If we're all in the state of becoming as a constant, we have to understand how we reduce risk at that scale, at the most critical pieces, to then get at the next pieces. Do those Band-Aids push back the critical timeline, or are we looking at major surgery all the time? We have to take those intermediate steps through risk assessment to understanding what those community needs are and push that critical timeline back for deeper investment. Did you ask something about insurance? I'm not sure.
No. No, I love talking about insurance, but not this time. I'm actually going to go a little bit off script and ask you about the 2022 study that the AIA did. So in 2022, the AIA did a study to understand what their members and the wider society thought about climate change. Now, I'm going to misquote these numbers horribly, but they're roughly right. Like, it was 80% of architects felt that building to code was not adequate to build resilient buildings for the future. So architects knew that they're not building resilient buildings. Contractors thought that codes was good enough, and developers said, as long as we're building to code, all is fine. So there's a mismatch there. So I love what you're saying, but the whole ecosystem has to buy in.
I agree. So code is absolute minimum. But as was said, 80% of the buildings around, they were built in previous codes. So when the disaster comes, it doesn't matter if you were built under the 2023 code, 2025 code, 2026 up and coming. Those buildings are at high risk. So you're exactly right. There is a complete mismatch. When we have that ethical charge, you can't unknow these things about the health, safety, and welfare of the public and the planet. And we project forward those 7 generations, 100 years in the future. If we don't answer that, we have a liability issue that we have to take on as a professional, as a profession, as architects. So it behooves us, and it was great to hear those 80% of members saying, wait, code is the baseline, it's the absolute minimum. We have to answer what we know is going to happen. We know what is going to happen to these communities. So how do we get at that? How do we build better buildings? How do we finance it? And you're right on the numbers. And the other thing about that report, it's really interesting to see in that report to understand that, you know, in disasters, when you look at the business aspect of it, 55% of businesses that close during a disaster never reopen. When you look at that, that is a community killer. I work with small coastal communities and islands. If you lose that one apex business, the whole community suffers. It fails for decades. So you're right on those reports, and there's a lot more to share.
So what's your vision for how architects who know this, who have an ethical responsibility, engage with their principals to make sure the principals act? Because all you can do is advise.
Yeah, that's a great question. As I'm the incoming president, and I'm really driving very much for one thing. One, I was elected by a popular vote, so I've told all the members, be careful what you wish for, because I'm going to answer this question. Your minimum charge is to do exactly that. The disaster risk reduction of what we need to do to our communities is the first and foremost thing that I'm doing during my presidency. And we're pushing our members to understand that this is an absolute minimum. If you thought code was a baseline, now it's resilience. It is the baseline. If you really want to health, safety, and welfare and protect the public, that is the absolute minimum. That is my hope. But it's about partnerships. We don't do this alone. Everybody on this panel and the people in this room, it's everybody in civil society to the fellow NGOs, the funding mechanisms, engineers, architects, and those community leaders that already know the solution sets. When you said that, that is absolutely right. They know the solution sets. How do we partner with them? And I'm going to challenge my colleagues to do exactly that. You have to get into the communities and listen and reflect back. Did we hear you correctly? Because we are guests here to really get at that future that we must secure.
You have my vote.
Thank you.
John, may I turn to you and start to think about finance? Echo Shui, I think, quoted Mia Motley saying that if it's not insurable, it's not bankable. And the finance sector, certainly the asset-backed, whether that's mortgages or sort of corporate asset-backed finance, have been looking at the risks of climate change for some time. How do they perceive resilience issues?
Yeah, no, thank you, Amy. I think that there are a couple important things that one can think about in terms of bank practices. But principally, when you think about the banks, their primary concern, of course, is getting their money back. So it really comes back to a credit risk issue and the ability to develop insights and decision support tools that look at the probability of default or that look at the probability of default and then the losses associated with in the event of a default. So what the banks have been doing is really building up granular data at the individual customer level and then looking at how each of those customers, so it could be a homeowner, but it could also be a corporate, how they will behave under different macro and climate scenarios. And that granular understanding is really what's driving pricing, capital allocation, and decisions around products as well. So to your question specifically about residential mortgage and homeowners, one of the real questions that's out there is, as you look at climate, the cost of home ownership will increase because of the cost that not only of building resilience, but essentially the uncertainty associated with the predictability of that asset, right? Because of the weather volatility, because of the uncertainty. So we believe that over time there will be ecosystem changes necessary in order to continue to maintain access and affordability. Those will come in part through things like the building code, but they will also come in part through incentives from the public sector in terms of hardening assets, in terms of making economic incentives to replace existing roofs with hurricane-proof roofs after an event. And then ultimately they ought to manifest themselves in lower cost of credit. So the banking sector does care quite a bit about an event risk. I think we've heard a lot of statistics around the implications of the billion-dollar-plus storms that we're seeing increase. You know, we're 3 times our long-term average in the United States in terms of billion-dollar losses. So the idea of building resilience, changing the building codes, and having ecosystem solutions, not only for the provision of finance, but also the provision of insurance, and then the building and use of better building materials.
And do you think there are any lessons from that regulatory process that countries could learn from as they think about building their national adaptation plans? As I said at the beginning, so few countries have developed and published their national adaptation plans.
Yeah, I think, Amy, there are a number of different things that I would say. Virtually all the banks have been asked over time, really since, if you will, go back to COP26, which had its first finance day. But under the TCFD, banks had been asked to develop scenario analysis under a 2-degree scenario. Since then, the PRA and the ECB have come out and asked the banks to develop scenario analysis. I think the insights from all of that scenario analysis can really be used to inform national adaptation plans, because ultimately what the insights from the bottom-up analysis reveal is the possibility of what adaptation levers can be pulled to change that risk profile. And it's understanding those adaptation levers and the change in terms of return on investment that the governments can learn from. So I do see real value in the insights from the bottom-up analysis that the financial sector has done and linking that to government plans and actions.
So this may be a bit of an unfair pivot, but do you think we're sending some mixed messages? Because we say to corporates, you need to think about managing your risk, not just at your own assets, but you need to think about the system within which you work. So you need to think about the climate risk within your supply chain. And yet their supply chain is often dependent on players in developing parts of the world that may have less resilience. Do you think that there's a bit of a mixed signal between the need for national adaptation plans, the need for resilience in the supply chain, yet the supporting development of those countries?
Good question. What I would say is the following. I think from a pure corporate risk perspective, it's inherent to really understand the interconnectedness across supply chains globally. And that is a baseline understanding that all corporates should undertake and all lenders or purveyors of credit to corporates should understand. However, it's also the case that banks themselves, through their understanding of climate, have really tried to take that knowledge and become trusted advisors to basically help their clients understand those risks, similar to the work that Linda referenced that Zurich is doing in terms of really coming to the same side of the table with the client, understanding those risks. So I would say that there's opportunities for banks to help their clients de-risk those supply chains, but in part because of the financing that they provide and the ability for them to offer pools of counterparties that could lower the risk by providing trade finance and other solutions that can really integrate those smaller suppliers that don't yet have the access to capital and the insurance to be able to build that resilience on their own.
I can add to that. I totally agree that banks are looking to become these trusted advisors, and within IDB Invest we work with financial institutions across Latin America, and we have seen that there is more and more interest, for example, in banks that have a heavy portfolio of clients for agribusiness, for example, where we have supported them in adopting physical climate risk managements. So they don't stay in identifying which of their clients is most vulnerable, but they are interested in identifying adaptation technologies that they can include in green loans or green credit lines. So far, all the green loans and green credit lines have been heavily focused on mitigation technologies, but now they are interested in including these adaptation technologies as well.
I'm conscious of time, and so I want to thank everyone for sharing the insights around the challenges that are being faced, how they're being navigated, the impetus from architects to be part of the solution and to be educating them, and the fact that there's private finance is trying to support both the understanding and the solutions to finance these projects. So very happy to take any questions.
Good afternoon. Hey, good afternoon. Very enjoyable. I'm going to direct my question to John, but I don't mean it just to you. You raised some hardening issues. So I'm Mike Beck. I'm with the UC Santa Cruz Center for Coastal Climate Resilience. And you pointed to a number of factors where the industry is actually providing incentives for hardening, which is to say to continue to build in very risky environments and make it cheaper to do so. That's one way of looking at it. I see very few, and I know coastal very well, very few incentives for working with nature from the industry. What's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. We have been doing a lot of work, Mike, specifically on the steps that financial services can take to promote a nature-positive transition. I would say just generally, and you can refer to some of the more recent reports and material, I don't see the industry yet fully there in terms of nature-positive transition, but I don't think that we should give up hope on that regard, right? When you look at activities in the European community in particular, there's a lot of interest. We've had the privilege of working alongside FSD Africa and piloted the TNFD in the African subcontinent in terms of embracing nature. So nature-positive transition is real. It's happening. The momentum behind the TNFD is real. But certainly if you look at the United States, it's a little bit of a different pace relative to the rest of the world.
Please. Could I just, do you know the work that was done in Hoboken, New Jersey after Hurricane Sandy? So you know it? Yeah. So Tropical Storm Ophelia came through after they did the adaptation to sponge cities. And the entire community was out of business for one day instead of what happened in Sandy, which was 120 days of recovery and downtime. So it does work, but the financial stack behind it is interesting to look at because it's there, but it's only about 16%. Since then, it's grown to about 21% on East Coast communities, but it's still far, far away. So I agree with you. It depends on what the governor in that state is doing. Our governor, and certainly New Jersey, they're really going after it. But the financial stack is not quite there, what you're talking about. But the hard change and the proof exists.
I'd just also add from an insurance lens that the insurance models don't really know how to quantify nature-based interventions yet. And so I think that's a piece of work that we need to own so that can be quantified in the way that we know that a sprinkler system reduces the frequency and severity of a fire. How do we think about spongy cities as part of that resilience? And so we need to build out our models to understand that and quantify it better.
Yeah, I think if Mike had the mic, he would cite the Coastal Risk Index that work he's done with AXA and Aura and others to kind of quantify some of that. So, Mike, I think it's a great challenge, and it's one that the industry needs to get better on, and a lot of us are trying. But Mike Beck, for those of you who don't know, is really leading a lot of that topic as well. Look, I want to thank the panel, but I want to point out another, I think first, Linda talked about how she was in a back alley talking about resilience, 10 COPs ago or whatever. Now we have an architect leading a charge to reduce the risk even before it gets to the insurance sector. So if anyone wonders whether things are changing, just look at things in context, because I think things are changing quite dramatically, and it's going to be leaders like Mike or like Ilya and others in the room that make it happen. So thank you, panel, very much. If you want to get a glass of water or stretch or just somehow get less uncomfortable, please do so. But we are going to bring up the next panel. And the next panel, we're moving into implementation. Oh, you guys can take a picture. Mike Beck's trying to sneak into this picture over on the side, too. But the next panel is really around one about implementation and what are we going to do about all this. And to lead this panel, our third partner in this afternoon of programming is the Atlantic Council. For those of you who don't know Jorge Gastamundi, get to know him because he's somebody who knows his way around, former Peruvian negotiator at the COP, really understands the issues, really understands the role of the private sector, and has really been a leader in kind of coalescing different efforts, including this one here today. So Jorge, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Francis, for that kind introduction. And thanks for the panel. You were so excited you're still hanging around, and it's amazing. So let me invite my fellow panelists here. First, Debbie Hillier, who is the head of Zurich Climate Resilience Alliance program. Debbie, please. Cara Williams, senior partner, global ESG and sustainability leader at Mercer. And last but not least, Emmanuel Guérin, fellow at the European Climate Foundation. And just to shift things around, I'm going to sit here because your moderators have been sitting there. So it's all good. We now, if you have followed this journey over the past hour and a half, we have identified the risks. We hopefully have been able to quantify and give value to those risks. And through that, we've been able to then sit down and start identifying how, as a society, we're going to be sharing that risk throughout the continuum. What part is picked up by the public sector, what part is picked up by the private sector, how do you actually, bring them to the table? It's an exercise that gives us a good sense of where we are standing. But now we need to come up with the solutions. And the solutions come from both, risks at the project level, but also economic and financial valuation that you have to carry out across a curve of costs to identify which are the best solutions that are fitting those risks and those problems that you need to deal with. And those valuation tools might give you a good sense of which of those are economic, and hence public potentially support. You will also get some indication of what are some return on investments at the financial level that you then allow to start bringing the private sector into it. And in some other cases, you might even be able to blend solutions and look for ways in which public could attract private and then figure out ways to collaborate between different actors. So we have that solved in the past two panels. Now the question is, with all that information, how do you actually make it happen? Where do you get the money from? How do you align capital stacks into those needs and those solutions? So that's a challenge that we have for the next 45 minutes to solve the problems of the world on this one. And it's, as much as I'm making it sound a bit comical, that's a reality. That's where the rubber hits the road. It's what really, really matters, how to figure out mechanisms that will allow to channel financial resources to the right solutions. So let me start with Debbie from where you sit at the Alliance, at the Climate Resilience Alliance. How you've been able to identify approaches that will deliver financial resources to communities with whom you're working and advancing your efforts. And the solutions, and also just a reflection in terms of the challenges and the barriers that you're facing.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so I work for Mercy Corps, but also as part of the Zurich Climate Resilience Alliance, as Linda mentioned earlier. Initially, we were the Flood Alliance, and now we're the Climate Alliance. Been running for about 15 years. And we work at community level, and then all the way up to policy level. Policies both at the local, at the provincial, and the national, and then up, obviously, here to global level as well. So I think the first thing to say, and it's probably been said today already, is that resilience has to be locally driven, has to be contextual. So there are no single solutions. It has to be driven from the bottom up. We need to understand the hazards. We need to understand the risks. We need to understand the vulnerabilities. So there's no single set of solutions. But we do know what those solutions are, but there's no single set that can be applied everywhere. We also know how to do this. So again, this has to be very much done with communities. So I think the most important thing then in the work that we do is that we very much empower communities to build their own resilience. We don't do it for them. We don't arrive with a nice shiny box of solutions. But we work with communities, developing the data, the analysis to really understand what needs to be done. So as an example, we work with communities so that they can, we empower them so they can build their own resilience. So in Nepal, for example, we're working with communities there, and they've got some funding to build a shelter, evacuation shelter for flooding. So we didn't do that, but we supported them, gave them the skills, and then they got the funding to do that. One thing I guess that is always a solution that's necessary is early warning systems. We are part of the Early Warning for All initiative. We work very much on that. And we have a people-first approach. And that sounds simple. It sounds obvious. But it's not always that easy. No, I think it's me. I don't think it's it. I think it's me. So as an example, we have a program in Jordan. And we work in Petra. I don't know if anyone's been lucky enough to visit the archaeological site there. It's fantastic, but it's very vulnerable to flash flooding. And so they have got an early warning system there. But it's completely audio-driven. It's so if there is a flash flood coming, then the warning is transmitted by sound through the mosques and through sirens, which is fine if you have good hearing. And also if you can move very quickly, because flash flooding, you've got 30 minutes to get out of the way. So there are some mobility issues there as well. So we've been working with the government there to kind of bring in those aspects of ability. And then policy change, right? That's where you get the scale. I think that was one of your points. We do a lot of work at community level, but then we also take that to scale through policy change. And in Indonesia, for example, we're working on places that are completely flooded, coastal permanent flooding on the coast. And whilst the government of Indonesia is actually very good at disaster response, this kind of permanent situation is a little bit different. So if there's an earthquake or a tsunami, they're brilliant. They come in, they have all the systems. But the permanent situation is much more difficult. So we've been working with them on policy change, using our experience of working with communities, through building resilient livelihoods, through supporting communities where migration is the only option, and then working with that through policy change at the national level. And I think in terms of the challenges, I think that was your second question, you won't be surprised, obviously, that funding is the problem. And I just want to give one example on this. So we did a big report this year around the role of the private sector in terms of adaptation finance. We hear a lot that the private sector has a big role to play, and of course many people here are from the private sector. But what we looked at was how much the private sector can really pay for adaptation. We know there's a big role for the private sector in providing the upfront financing, of course. But a lot of adaptation is a public good. And so, but we couldn't find any analysis of this. Like what is the role of the private sector? Of the 300 and something billion, how much of that could actually be paid for by the private sector? And we know that a lot of adaptation is public goods. So big coastal seawalls, with the best will in the world, the private sector is not going to pay for that. Again, they might provide the upfront financing, they might provide the materials, but it has to be paid for by the government or by users or by locals. So we did this analysis. We found out that actually the private sector could potentially fund 15 to 20% of the adaptation funding needed. Now that's good, right? That's not nothing. That's very helpful. But it does mean there's a lot of funding still needs to come from the public sector, and that remains a challenge.
Thank you, Debbie. And yeah, we came across that report, and we wish the number was a bit higher than 15 to 20%. I'm convinced that while that's a number that it's established now, the dynamics are going to surprise us hopefully in the future, and that number is going to go up because of either better ways of collaborating, more information, better methodological approaches to assess cost-benefit analysis, or even just technology. So yeah, I'm a big believer that we can move in that direction of increasing that number down the road. Kara, a lot of the bottlenecks that are found when looking at the private sector and how they could invest on adaptation, and then hence moving into implementation, is perceived risks, particularly in developing countries, in which the private sector might think, this is something that we would rather invest in an emerging economy or a developed economy as opposed to other kind of countries. Without getting into the details in terms of which countries, because the question is probably not going there, it's more of how do you ensure that the private investors understand the value of their investments, the returns, and also understand most importantly the risks when they're getting into it, and how to build that confidence, but also how to help them track the potential impacts and results of their investments.
On? Yeah, there we go. So yeah, thank you. So just quickly, I work for Mercer. We are investment consultants, amongst other things. But in this context of this conversation, we advise about $16.5 trillion. That's both private as well as public money. And I'd say your question is an interesting one, right? So yeah, I mean, I think in the past we've always been very focused on risk, and I think risk has been predominantly around transparency and access to data, right? So if you're going to invest in these places, I think the common excuse was we just don't have the data in order to validate these investments. Frankly, the data's gotten so much better over the last 3 to 5 years. There's been massive amounts of investment. AI has helped significantly. So I think data is actually starting to play less and less of a role when people are saying that they don't have the transparency that they need and the access they need. What you're starting to see, though, I think, is the question around the opportunity, right? Especially if we're talking about private sector money. And there's a whole bunch of work that already happens for corporations that are trying to protect their own business, right? If they're in manufacturing or agriculture, there's a lot of work that gets done around sustainability, be cynical or not, but it's to make sure that their businesses are sustainable and their supply chains remain sustainable. But I'm talking truly from an investment point of view. And investors need to see a return, right? And I think the biggest issue we've had around sort of resiliency and adaptation is where's the money? Right, that it's much harder to justify an investment if you have fiduciary responsibility to make certain investments where you can't say actually there's going to be a significant return, and I think that's where there's been a lot of creativity in the last couple of years. We're seeing things emerge like resilience bonds, which works a little bit like parametric insurance, but for investors. There are other types of mechanisms that are starting to emerge, which are really sort of municipal bonds in the United States and in the U.S. investment market. There are ways now to access and to tap into resiliency as a potential for alpha, for potential income. We don't see enough yet, though, right? So I think adaptation needs it's the coupling, the blended finance, right? We still need public sector to de-risk and take away some of the initial risk of these investments around adaptation in order for the private sector to be interested in investing. Because, like I said, the fiduciary duty is a big one, and they do need to make a return because you're dealing with people's retirement funds.
You raise a great. That's my singing voice. You raise a great point on that de-risking, on the role of public sector to de-risk investments. I'll come back to that and I'll point to Debbie for that conversation. But also I'll come back to you, Kara, with a follow-up question after we hear from Emmanuel. So, Emmanuel, from where you sit, at ECF, at the European Climate Foundation, working with projects and driving climate action. What examples can you share with us on progress that you're seeing on resilience investments, on adaptation, both globally, but also in your own experience? So just give us a bit of flavor from a philanthropy point of view, how you're seeing the ecosystem evolving into advancing adaptation and investments on adaptation.
Sure. And first, thanks a lot for the invitation, and thanks a lot in particular to you, Jorge, for everything you're doing here at COP to make sure that adaptation and resilience is actually at the forefront of the agenda beyond the rhetoric. I guess the first thing to say is that philanthropy, like the private sector, like development banks, has been a bit slow to awake to the challenge of adaptation and resilience, and that's probably directly related to what you were just saying. I mean, it's a bit more difficult to see how you can build concrete, direct, short-term revenue from adaptation compared to mitigation, but I think this is changing. And in fact, that is changing very fast. So what we see in philanthropy, working both with the private sector and with local communities, is that I think historically the conversation with the private sector on adaptation and resilience was mainly about two things. It was about what companies can do to invest in adaptation and resilience to protect their own assets, their own operations, and the other thing was what can companies do to benefit from the growth of the market in adaptation and resilience technologies, products, and services, and all of that is good. And should continue, of course. But I think we're at a point where the private sector is getting more and more engaged to deliver more broad-based, more systemic adaptation and resilience benefits. So here are a couple of examples of what we see through our work, and rather than going into too many details country by country, I'd like to build a bit of a category of how public-private collaboration can be built on adaptation and resilience. And I'll go from the simplest and the most straightforward to what I think is more difficult and in a way more cutting edge. First, as I said, you can co-invest in between the public and the private in a company's own protection. I mean, the protection of its own facilities and operations. And I guess the typical example that we're seeing replicated all across the world is a beverage company co-investing with a local local authority into water facilities. We see that more and more happening. Going one step further, you can see joint investment by the public and the private to build supply chain resilience, which goes beyond the scope of a company facility or operations. And here too we're seeing many more food companies, for example, investing in farmers upstream in the value chain to invest in the resiliency of crops. Then you can build projects that have direct revenue streams for adaptation. I think it's important to stress that adaptation is often a public good, but you can make a profit. That's the case, for example, for some of the sustainable transport infrastructure. You can design fees or tolls. You see more and more tunnels, for example, being built for the dual use of the traffic of cars, but also water management. Then you can build projects that monetize not just the adaptation benefit, but the adaptation co-benefits. and there are ways to include those calm benefits in the financing model. And here, I guess, the typical example is the protection or the restoration of mangroves that lead to the creation of blue carbon credits. Then I think there is something that is a bit untapped as a potential for public-private cooperation, but building resilience in cities increases the price of land and the price of real estate. And frankly, I think we should think of innovative financing mechanisms that are based on the fact that there is value creation through resilient urban design. And finally, what I think is the frontier of the private sector involvement in adaptation and resilience is, as I said, the private sector getting involved into projects that have broad-based, diffuse, cross-sectoral benefits, and so I think this is where we should be going into the future.
Emmanuel, you gave us a set of archetypes, a taxonomy in terms of the kind of things that could be done on a public-private. I was going to use my next round of questions to actually ask what you already answered. So let me just shift a bit. So I usually use this phrase that it takes two to tango on adaptation finance. You need, and I think of the public side and the private side, and how to bring them together, build bridges. I guess, and I'll use today that takes three to tango with a philanthropic side, so it's even harder. Tango is already hard, so three people in a dance. But
it's carimbo, not tango anymore.
So we have the examples. Those are bubbling up to a degree, that it's exciting, it's intriguing. Where do we go from here? Like, what do we need to do from where you sit, from where you are working with the partners that you're working, to make this kind of bubbling up become standard, become mainstream, in which ways in which, public and private are looking together when they can, where public needs to act and they are willing to act where they can, where private by itself, ways in which Emmanuel was mentioning, could actually go ahead and do it as well. What needs to happen? And I'm building on inspiration from what Emmanuel referred. Here at COP, we are going to be seeing some developments around bringing efforts on elevating the role of private sector on adaptation finance that are going to be announced in end of this week and next week by the presidency. I won't reveal I won't spoil the surprise, but there is something cooking up there. From where you sit, how do you move to that point in which you start mainstreaming some of the things that you're seeing bubbling up? So sorry for putting you on the spot, but you might have been thinking about that already. So I hope that it's not new in your minds. So I'll start backwards. So Emmanuel, you start, then we'll go to Cara, and we close with Debbie.
So let me answer your question by being very clear and very specific about what the private side of the equation needs to do and what the public part of the equation needs to do, and then conclude with a comment on the link with the negotiations here at COP and how to connect that with what's happening in the negotiating rooms. To start with the private part of the equation, I think what is the most important is that the private sector, I'm not talking here about the insurance companies or the financial sector, but the actual business, the industry. It's important that the business sector engages proactively into this discussion and stops thinking that the public is going to take the lead on its own and is going to foot the entire bill. Because I think it is still, in many cases, what we see. And as I said, there are ways for businesses to stop looking at adaptation and resilience as a cost, but to actually look at it possibly as value creation in some cases. And it's not just a financing challenge. As I said, it's about building a revenue stream. It's about looking beyond the simple adaptation and resilience benefits. It's going to the co-benefits. It's about engaging with the different stakeholders, in particular with local authorities. But I think, yes, businesses have to map out their risks. What I think, and we've already talked about that, so I won't be long on that, but I will insist on the fact that the mapping of the risks needs to go beyond the scope of facilities or operations and needs to integrate the entire value chain. I mean, you get a completely different way to look at it if you do this. And yes, I presented 6 different archetypes for public-private collaborations, but the reality is always more difficult than those archetypes. I mean, it's about blending those 6 different archetypes into an actual project. And so I think the private sector really needs to think for itself, what is the model that works for me? How do I combine these 6 different archetypes into a solution that works for me? And how do I engage proactively in designing the right type of blended finance mechanism that combines grants with concessional loans, with guarantees, with outcome performance-based financing instrument into something where they can really make a revenue. So that's for the private sector part of it. For the public sector part of it, and that's connected to a discussion here on country platforms, I think what's most important is to translate those big ideas, those big national adaptation plans at the national level, or even sometimes at the regional or local levels, into actual bankable, investable projects. And it does take a lot of time and energy and human resources to do this. Barbados, for example, did this. They've got brilliant people. It took them a long time to do it. And we're very far from seeing that in many of the other SIDS and LDCs. And this is, by the way, where I think both philanthropic money and money from the Development Bank should be spent to translate those national adaptation plans into investment bankable projects. I think where the public sector really has to help as well is reducing the friction in the delivery and implementation of those adaptation and resilience projects. And I'm thinking in particular of the permitting process. And I'm thinking also about the mainstreaming of the resilience-based public procurement schemes. So for me, those are 2 very clear things for the public to do. And I said I would conclude with some remarks that connect this conversation with what's happening in the negotiating rooms. I mean, for anyone who's been part of those negotiations, I mean, it's very clear that there is a massive expectation from the developing countries participating into the conversation that adaptation finance should be grant-based as opposed to mitigation finance. And so I think it's very important to respect this part of the conversation. That's the dynamic of this conversation. It has a logic of its own. I think it's very important to combine that with the fact, as I said, that there is an opportunity for the private sector to look at adaptation not just as a public good, but something that can bring value creation and profits. And it's, let's progress along those 2 tracks, see progressively how they can merge. But I think it's important to realize that those 2 have different dynamics in a way.
Thank you, Manuel. Thank you for that, very comprehensive, and giving us also the perspective in terms of what's happening out of here, which is quite a stark difference from what we're discussing. And you find that there are several here in this room that have seen that in real time and how governments are thinking in the negotiations, different from whenever they're in their capitals and dealing with either private sector or other kind of factors in society. Kara, to you.
Yeah, I think I'll take probably a much shorter route to response, which is I think a developed and regulated carbon market will be such an important cornerstone to changing the way that people invest and the way that they look at investments. You know, if we take even your example of the mangroves, right? That the fact that you can actually financially benefit from that, from the carbon, the carbon absorption, but at the same time have a positive effect on on the local community around flooding and other things. That to me is the key, right? Until you've got the financial hook, and carbon markets are an easy one, and everybody's looking to offset. That to me is kind of the lowest hanging fruit.
Could you think of something parallel? I understand that the point is regulation, but could you think of something parallel that could be built around adaptation and resilience? Because, of course, carbon markets have the value of both mitigation and adaptation, but it's not solely adaptation, and there are some things that might not be able to use nature-based solutions, so just hard infrastructure. So could you think of any other mechanisms or similar to carbon markets, or is that the way to go?
I mean, I mentioned it earlier before. Fixed income markets obviously help as well. The resilience bonds, green bonds. And obviously, there's a lot of trouble around green bonds, but I think they've gotten better. The fixed income market is probably the other easiest way to attract assets, and again, that's on the resiliency side as opposed and the adaptation side rather than truly the mitigation side.
Excellent, thank you, Cara. Debbie, to you to start closing, and then we'll have a couple of minutes for questions from the audience.
Thank you. Yeah, and I want to thank Emmanuel. I think you balanced everything really, really well. There is a kind of tension between the public and the private, and I think it's reasonable to say that and be clear on that. There are different roles for public and private. And I guess one extra point to make from my side is that the private sector, in terms of investing in adaptation, will, beyond investing in its own, making its own supply chain resilient, which of course it should do, like as a given, but beyond that, I think the private sector is more likely to invest in kind of big projects, scale projects, high tech, low risk, and therefore not very likely to invest in programs that really work with communities, because we all know that participation and consultation, it takes time. It takes investment of time and money, and the private sector is not a charity. That's not what it's for. So we shouldn't expect them to do that necessarily. So just recognizing where the private sector has a particular role and where it's maybe not so well suited. And then the other point I want to make is again around the evidence. I think there's, as Avinash Persaud would say, there's lots of shiny things. There's lots of nice, fun things which might work in some instances, but don't necessarily work at scale. And so any kind of conversation around adaptation, resilience in the private sector needs to be really based on evidence and analysis. And one point around blended finance, it comes up all the time. And again, we did some work as part of our research this year on adaptation, and found that for every $1 of concessional finance, the private sector brought 51 cents. So we tend to think of ratios of 1 to 4, like that's the sort of number that we're more used to. But actually, when you do the maths, when you add up the kind of bilateral funding and the funding from development finance institutions, which is concessional, then the extra that the private sector brings is much less. Now, it's still not nothing. 51 cents is still useful, right? That's not a bad thing. But again, it's understanding the evidence and really making sure that we get that so that we can make sensible choices about where the public and the private sector have a role. Oh, can I add one more thing? Sorry. I just came from the LDC's did a press conference on adaptation finance. It's coming back to Emmanuel's point. So made a really eloquent point that adaptation is not optional, and adaptation finance is not charity. And it does bring it back to the negotiations, as Emmanuel was saying, that there is this legal obligation. Developed countries shall provide finance, and that shall is a specific word. It means there's a legal obligation. So it's not convenient, it's not easy, but the role of the public sector is very important.
Thank you, Debbie. And with that, we'll open to anybody that would like to make a question. We've been here for almost, now it's 2 hours since we started. For those that have been here for the whole segment, my respects. You follow us through a very nice journey of risk, valuation, and hence implementation after. Ritu, please. And there's a microphone right behind you.
Thank you. That was a very engaging discussion. I want to go back to Emmanuel's point, and I'll pick on what Debbie said in the beginning. It has to be built bottom up. So when we talk about public-private partnership, we quite often miss the community angle. And we think that community is someone that's not going to invest. In fact, communities are one of the biggest investors. And I actually made a side comment to that when you said, community is already investing, is it not? Even without, when you don't invest in adaptation and resilience, who's bearing the cost of disasters? It's the community. They are bearing it by losing their assets, their houses, or whatever, or crops. And if you go and talk to the community, they are willing to invest. In fact, I was quite surprised when I was doing this research in India, and I kept quizzing the community. I said, the community which got subsidy for insurance premium, they were fine. But people who did not get subsidy, they were paying it from their own pocket because they knew that compensation was important. So I'm just saying that, how much are you considering community as part of your equation when you talk about, solutions like this? And they are one of the biggest investors by far.
Thank you, Ritu. And I gather there was another question there, no? Okay. I fully, I just wanted to make sure that, I didn't miss a question. I fully agree with that comment. I think it's come up out of this conversation as well, so thanks for the contribution. Sarisher, good to see you.
Thanks. I had a question around the strictness of definitions, because I think one of the things that we see is an interchangeability of the terminology a lot when it comes to adaptation and resilience finance. I mean, I completely agree mangroves is an amazing solution in terms of addressing carbon sequestration and potential for looking at flood risk and other kind of NBS solutions within adaptation. But I think there seems to be a lot of interchangeability of where solutions can be used. So what's the panel's perspective on how strict we need to be on the definition of what adaptation and resilience is? Or is it a good thing to have these kind of merged perspectives when it comes to actually driving capital towards the challenges?
I think we're challenged in general around nomenclature in this sector, right? I mean, everything about it is always debated. And I think your point is very right. I think there's a general understanding, though, that mitigation is let's stop what we're doing and try to at least hold back like the progress or the negative progress, if you will. And adaptation is much more, okay, this is happening, so let's protect ourselves from it happening. I mean, that's just sort of our approach on what these two are. Maybe you have something more sophisticated.
I think there is a tension, because in the context of the negotiations, in particular the negotiations on adaptation finance, it's important to be quite strict about the definition from an accounting perspective, if you will. When you're talking about real action on the ground, this is where, frankly, sometimes this distinction doesn't make sense, and it's more interesting, as you said, to bring together adaptation and mitigation and find the right financing model that combine different sources. So I understand the need to be strict in the context of the negotiations and an accounting exercise. I am quite frankly sometimes a bit more excited about the real life projects on the ground that combine different dimensions.
And to that, I mean, they don't have to be mutually exclusive, right? Like, ideal world, you'd be able to have a project that mitigates and adapts, right? Like, that's not a bad thing.
Okay, so just to give you a sense of projection on where we're going with this. We're finishing this panel. We're finishing a journey that we've done over the past 2 hours. And now we're going to move into a set of closing remarks by a couple of very reputed actors in the field of private sector insurance. And then after that, there's going to be a reception.
We've got a great panel, two really incredible folks to be on the panel. So really happy to be talking about resilience and the impacts around business and economic growth and what that means going forward. So I'm Nat Cohan. I lead the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, or C2ES. We're a nonprofit based in DC. We do a number of things. We work with companies on a number of issues, but increasingly, one of the things we're really focused on, that our companies are very focused on, is on resilience. And so we've been doing more and more of this work and really looking forward to this panel. And I'll tell you one quick thing that we hear from the companies again and again, and then it's as a sort of framing. And I'll be interested to see whether Michelle and whether Lord Stern, you've heard the same thing. But we often think about the intersection between resilience and corporate action as being one of just, corporate self-interest. It's the supply chain and so on. What we hear from every one of our companies is that resilience doesn't occur in a vacuum. It's something that is about their coming in and out. What we hear about from every one of our companies is that resilience doesn't occur in a vacuum. It's something that they have to think about in terms of investing in their communities, investing in thriving economic growth. And so I think that's something that really applies across the board. So I will, if for those of you who don't know, I'll introduce our panelists very quickly. First, Michel Liez, the chairman of Zurich Insurance Group, who has a perspective informed by over 40 years of experience in global insurance and reinsurance. I'm going to say over 40 years, therefore, that I can over-under, and property and casualty insurance. So really, obviously, insurance is so critical to all these things. And then Lord Nick Stern, co-chair of the independent high-level expert group on climate finance. I think I got that right. No, and then the chairman of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at London School of Economics. And of course, Lord Stern, I'm an economist by training. To environmental and climate economists, I'll eat the mic before too long. To climate economists, Lord Stern is one of the folks who has been doing this work and sounding the point about climate and about the economic opportunities in climate as long as anybody. So really happy to have this, and maybe I can begin with Zurich's perspective. So Michelle, as chair of the Insurance Development Forum, you've got, I think, a really privileged view of the work that the industry is doing to build capacity in emerging markets. And I would just invite you to share a little bit about that. Are you optimistic? We know that there's some growing energy around national adaptation plans. Will that produce the kind of changes we need to prepare change for countries for climate's effect? How are you seeing those developments?
Thank you for the question. It's definitively, I'm happy that you mentioned the Insurance Development Forum, because it is definitively this type of joint venture with political authorities, the World Bank, and large insurance group, which is contributing to try to find together solution to what we want to address. I must say, if you allow me, this COP has something very positive. The world insurance has been mentioned probably 10 times more than in the last 5 COPs altogether. So we are slowly coming to the... Like that? Like a rock star? I feel much better. The world insurance has been mentioned much, much more than before. And it's simply the fact that insurance is part of, is a parameter which is part of what we are trying to achieve. On resilience, in all fairness, if the world insurance would not exist, I suppose that what we do could be defined by resilience. That's exactly what we are trying to do. That's what we are trying to achieve. So what we remark with the Insurance Development Forum is the readiness, also because of needs of effective emerging economies, to have this kind of debate with the insurance industry. They are massively interested in our investment capability, and as insurer, we can invest in infrastructure, but are also massively interested in a way in which we can risk model and let them understand exactly where to invest in order to avoid large bad events. So I must say that I sometimes recognize more openness by emerging economies on the contribution of insurance, its risk modeling capabilities, its risk analysis, than I sometimes hear from mature country for the national level, I speak. And that's something which is, in my view, very, very positive, and it's up to us to answer to these needs. But it's so obvious that resilience has absolutely no political dimension for us. It's simply a need that we try to cover, and where we try to bring our industry to contribute to cover in an efficient fashion. So I'm sometimes a little bit upset to see that words as these one do try to, or do start to have a kind of political dimension, which in my view is total nonsense.
Well, thanks for that. And I think the idea of insurance as resilience is a really interesting point. Can you speak a little bit about the role of private industry? How do you see private industry making investments in adaptation and resilience? What's that role, again, beyond maybe their own supply chains, but providing broader resilience for communities that they're in?
You know, one of the key elements in what we observe is also the money that is invested before compared to the money which is invested after. And I know that each time an insurer is saying that, people think, okay, this guy is speaking about premium and instead of claims. We are not only speaking about premiums when we speak about money invested before. We're speaking about infrastructure investment. And that is something on which a lot can be done. A lot can be also done by insurer. At IDF, we've launched a fund for resilient infrastructure. It includes probably some discussion with the regulators in order to free up a little bit of the capacity of investment of the insurance industry. But I do believe that investment in resilient infrastructure is probably one of the key elements which can moderate the intensity of natural catastrophe. And we need to definitively accelerate that. We are still in a phase in which less than 10% is invested before, more than 90% is invested after the catastrophe. And we know that each dollar, each pound, each Swiss franc invested before would be 5 times to 10 times more valuable than what is happening after. But this 90%, we never achieve to get rid of it.
So I think that notion of the economic returns to investment is a great time to bring in Lord Stern. So, Lord Stern, you've talked a lot about the...
Nick will do.
Okay, good. All right, thank you, Nick. So, Nick, you've written a lot, you've talked a lot about the growth opportunity and the net zero transition overall. How do you see that playing out, and how does that economic growth story play out with respect to resilience and adaptation?
Well, is this working? How about this? Okay. Technical genius. The adaptation returns, if you look at the returns to the investment, are usually 3, 4, 10 times. The benefits 3, 4, 10 times the cost. Well, if you have an investment with returns like that, it is good for growth. It's telling you that you're getting back much more than you're putting in. So that's a basic growth story, that simple rate of return analysis. You all know, of course, that if you don't do it, if you don't make that investment, then the counterpart of that is you undermine growth. So I think what we really should be looking for now is the awareness of the need to invest, the ability to do so, and that varies very much. I mean, I've worked much of my life in rural India and elsewhere. The small farmer, the small household can do water harvesting. You know, that's insurance against drought. But the small farmer cannot do making room for water by increasing the floodplains. So some things that you can do yourself, some things you have to do together. So the ability to respond is something very important, where both the individual and the local community have have to take part. But it does depend on awareness. You know, the ability to act will only be exercised if there's awareness of the need to act. And there I think there's much more that we can do. Full transparency requires me to reveal that Michel and Zurich help support some of the research work we do at the Grantham Research Institute. So helping people understand risks, getting the data out there, getting it out there in a way that is really micro. You know, if people know that their house, their road is at risk, it's much clearer incentive to act than if, you know, that region is at risk. So part of the awareness is precision of information. Part of it is actually what the insurance companies tell you. You know, if they say we're not going to insure you because you're a flood risk, well, that may be the first time it's really come home to you that you've got a real problem. And so I think the way the insurance companies themselves behave and inform is a big part of awareness. Standards, building standards, are part of awareness. They tell you that you've got to have that kind of flood protection, or if it's you know, an earthquake, So I think the standards themselves convey information. So there's so much we can do on the information side, so much we can do on the ability to act, and then of course there's the finance, and that's a big part of the story. And for some of these things, you need long-term development finance, and that is extremely important. So I'd emphasize those things that enable you to act and enable you to harvest that growth story. And one final point, they usually tell you that you say final when you're 2/3 the way through because it gives them hope. But it really is the final point. We have to recognize how much of these actions are mitigation, adaptation, and development, all bound together. The examples are everywhere. Mangroves, mitigation, adaptation, development. Public transport, mitigation, adaptation, development. Restoring degraded land, mitigation, adaptation, development. Decentralized solar, you can go on. So the more those things are bound together, the more the ability and enthusiasm for pursuing, and the bigger the growth impact.
Michel, did you want to come in?
You know, what is sometimes missing when you're analyzing that is somebody at government level, it can be the province, can be the country, it can be something else, who is definitively feeling responsible of this situation. That's the moment in which I will share with you one of the biggest frustrations of my professional life, which I've shared with other people 1 hour ago. 10 to 12 years ago in Davos, in the WEF, which is one of the opportunities in which the private sector meets the politician, we wanted to launch the concept of country risk officer. Somebody who would be at the government level aware of what is happening, aware to discuss the priorities, knowing that we cannot do everything at the same time, but deciding with the knowledge of the risk and not only with the knowledge of what it costs to do things. Totally mishap. No country as a country risk officer. We are something like 12 years later. It took us time also, you know, after all, the chief risk officer were invented by insurance industry probably only 40 years ago. But that's definitively something, I'm sorry, the rock and roll singer. It's definitively something which would be needed in order to have a discussion with people who are taking care of what you're describing and being able to prioritize, because we won't be able to do everything at the same time. And I think it would be probably a lie to pretend that the private sector can take care alone of the prioritization of the problem that you describe. But having a partner which is speaking of risk and not only speaking of price would be massively valuable. Never achieved it.
Could I illustrate that?
Can I frame it? I want to frame it a little bit as you go, because I think you'll. I wanted to get to, and we're getting to, this question of the balance of markets versus private sector. And Nick, you mentioned insurance, you mentioned information provision, you mentioned standards. How do you think, maybe as you answer, how do you think about that balance in the adaptation case between the role of the markets and the role of the government?
Could I just, it's a part of the answer to this question, but I also wanted to back up what Michel just said. When I did the Stern Review 20 years ago, I was, for that brief period of my life, a civil servant. That's not my genetic makeup, but for 3 years I did it, and I enjoyed it. And we did the Stern Review, and I offered, because I was a permanent secretary, and I offered to the other permanent secretaries a briefing. The first people who came to me were MI5 and MI6, yeah? Because they understand security. That's their job. If you look at the United States, the people most on top of this are the US Navy and the CIA, yeah? They are, if you like, Michelle, they're sort of risk officers. That's what they do. But we need it much more broadly than that. So that's an illustration of the balance. There's some things that the public sector have to do. The Thames Barrier in the UK, I mean, London's on a floodplain. That's my city where I was born and grew up. Well, individual Londoners or individual companies can't really build the Thames Barrier. Yeah, they can't actually find out that, or they need to make it a bit bigger, or they need to strengthen it as the risks go up. So those kinds of major projects, and what I said, making room for water by, allowing the rivers to meander and reduce the flooding risk in a town, that's something which has to be driven by public sector. You might have a private contractor to do the bulldozing work to allow the water and so on, but it has to be driven by the public sector. On the other hand, if you do rainwater harvesting, then you can give lots of information, but that's something that the individual can do, and the individual does do. And there'll be lots of things in between.
Yeah. And maybe, Michelle, as you think, Nick, you've laid out, I think, really nicely, especially for a fellow economist, how to think about the kind of collective action problems and the information problems involved from government versus the individual. But I would say that the private sector can play, in some ways, an intermediate, not an intermediating view, but an intermediate view, big enough to make major investments more than just a household, but maybe not playing the same role as the government. So I wonder where you see big corporate, is there a role for industry and for the private sector playing a role alongside the role of the individuals that Nick was talking about and the role of government?
So between two economists, I will try to find my way. As a pure mathematician, I'm a little bit afraid. But no, there is definitively, and that's what the private sector is supposed to do, this kind of intermediary between the individual and the global political collectivity, and that's what the private sector is doing. And definitively there is quite a lot that can be done there. If you want, insurance is partly that. You don't go to the total solidarity of a nation, you go to a solidarity which is a little bit more controlled, but I think that is something which definitively makes a lot of sense. So I see a lot of role for the private sector. I must say there is just one good news for me, and it's really the only one, for the intensity of natural events, is that there was a time in which that was happening with such a frequency that it was very difficult for a democratic elected government to find interest, to be interested in that, because it was happening each 10 years, each 3 mandates or something like that. And the only positive thing of the intensity, and that's really the only positive thing, it is becoming so intense that now the timeline of the people taking care of these risks and the timeline of the politician taking the decision are slowly but surely aligning. It's a pity that we had to increase the frequency in order to see the alignment of these 2 dimensions, but I think it's happening. It's happening, and I do believe that there the private sector can definitively play an important role, but I insist we need also to have partners who discuss with us not only about money, but also about risk.
So let me bring it back to the COP, because of course we're here at the COP. We're 10 years on from Paris. This is being called, the adaptation COP in many ways. It's on the agenda of the negotiators, but it's also increasingly on the agenda of the world, as we've been talking about. I wonder, as you all look at both the potential role of the COP and how far we've come or haven't come since Paris, how do you think about the role of the international community? Now we'll take it way up. Individuals, companies, national governments. What's the role of the international community? What can the international community do? What can we do better? And what do you want to see coming out of the COP or out of the Baku to Belém roadmap to make this, to have the kind of actions we need? Maybe, Nick, I can start with you.
Yeah. I think there's a lot coming out of this COP already. You know, we had the Carbon Markets Open Coalition last week. We had the TFFF last week. You know, we've had, although it should have been more, we've had in the NDCs come in for covering 2/3 of the emissions. If you look back at Paris, we were talking about 4 degrees by the end of the century. And now, 10 years on, you know, we're talking about 2.5, 3. The trouble is that the science has moved on, that the risks associated with 2.5, 3, as understood now, are not dissimilar from the risks of 4 degrees as understood then. But that has been real progress. And I think the direct experience that Michel was talking about has also changed people's attitudes to adaptation. So, and rightly so. And we've moved on a lot then since Paris, but we should always include in sentences or paragraphs like that the final sentence in the paragraph, but nowhere near fast enough. But that shouldn't lead us to dismiss the progress that has been made. But I do think that the understanding of adaptation and natural capital, because of the experience, because of the science, and because of Brazil's leadership, have moved up the agenda in this COP, and that's very good. And this is an implementation COP. It's not a COP where you come on with a vast array of new commitments. How are you doing it? How do you do it? How can we help each other in implementing? And in that, it seems to me that adaptation has a absolutely central role to play. And it's really, you've got this public-private partnership reflected at the big level. You know, in order to understand what's happening to the climate, you need big analyses, you need big models, you need big data, you need AI actually to help you understand impacts all over the place. That kind of thing needs, as it were, international consortia to really make it happen, as well as the kind of public-private partnership that Michel was describing, where so much information comes from the insurance companies, so much information comes from the big climate analyses and modeling, and you put it all together, and there you've got information coming not only from the public sector but also from the private sector. So there's so many ways in which that mutual support can come, and I think one of the real positives of this COP is that that's coming much more to the surface.
Yeah. Michel?
Just again, I'm trying to be positive in each manner. So this kind of segmentation that we observe, and the fact that some countries have another view on what we discuss here than what we discuss here, is a kind of urgent call to action. So we stop trying to find an agreement where everybody on this planet is subscribing, because that's definitively from a political standpoint. We are not going in this direction, but I think this COP is one of the first COP in which, okay, we implement. As you say, we implement. Okay, and if implementation in Brazil is not exactly as implementation in Thailand, who cares? We implement. We start to do something. We stop trying to find a solution for all the planet because it doesn't exist. So trying to be positive, I understand that this segmentation about some of the big principles is also a call to action on local action, and I do believe at the end it will be bringing quite concrete results.
So we only have a couple minutes, so I'm going to ask one last question, and it's a twist on the usual kind of in 10 years here. So, and it's about how we think about success in the world of adaptation. I think if I were to say, what does success look like on the mitigation side in 10 years, we would have a good sense, the trajectory, we're bending the curve, peaked, and so on. Suppose we're 10 years out, we're at COP40, sorry. What does success look like on adaptation as measurably as possible? What do we say? Look, you know, we were at that COP we're COP30 in Brazil, and sure enough, here's what happened, and here's how we know. What does success look like on adaptation?
I think a deeper understanding of risk, so that country by country and region by region, the information and understanding of the risk had gone up. That's one measure. The second is that the risk had gone down. where because people had made, if it's adaptation, because people had made those adaptation decisions, including in that insurance. So success, for example, would be broader in insurance cover. So understanding of the risk, the reduction of the risk, and then the kind of measures that we've been discussing, like making room for the rivers and the water harvesting and the flood control and all those kinds of things. So those three levels, I think, understanding, actual risk reduction, and then measurement of those elements which have been part of that risk reduction.
I think Nick said it all. I must say that can be easily combined with an increased penetration of the insurance industry. And I do believe that increased penetration of insurance industry, and I'm not pledging for a business case or for Zurich or any other, but that's the way in which we can progress. Because we cannot look at the correlation between development of countries and penetration insurance. It's a clear correlation. And I know that things are coming before the other without wishing that more people enjoy, if I may say, this added value, simply, this added value of knowing better the risk that they run and the way in which they can protect themselves.
Thank you both. I will just add maybe on one more thing. I loved the answer you gave, Nick, and as well, Michel, as what you said. And I would say, and if we've done that, if we've improved that information provision, we've reduced the risk, then we will have seen, I think, the kind of economic thriving and prosperity as a result that we would not otherwise have seen. And that brings us back to sort of the start of the conversation.
Sadly, that will be most easily understood if there's some people who've done well at reducing the risk, and they can be compared with others.
Yes, but there's also the counter.
To make that case, but that
or the counterfactual, and seeing that there was, even despite extreme weather, that people were not as much as impacted as they have been. All right, we have to end it there. Thank you. Please join me in thanking our terrific panel.
Not only do we have a terrific panel, but a terrific audience that stuck with us for 2.5 hours of sweating together. In about 15 minutes, we're going to reward you. So if you can mill about, we're going to bring the drinks out, bring some food out, and kick off the COP. Thank you, Lord Stern. And thank you, Nat, and thank you, Michelle.